Hi there, my name is Madeleine Derache, and I work at the Yukon Human Rights Commission. Thank you for joining us for Human Rights Day 2021. On this day in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration states that each person is entitled to fundamental rights, including the right to equality and the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. It also recognizes the right to freedom of religion and speech and the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. Every year on this day, people around the world take steps to raise awareness and bring change to ongoing human rights issues. The United Nations spearheads this campaign, identifying a global theme each year. This year, the theme is equality, reducing inequalities, advancing human rights. The Yukon Human Rights Commission supports this goal, but we also believe that we cannot reduce inequality without equity. To create a society that respects the inherent dignity of all persons and allow for every person's full participation, we must understand that eliminating inequality is an outcome. Equity is how we get there. For those who are wondering what the difference is, equality would be to give everyone the same size clothing. Equity is to give people the clothing that fits. When the focus is on equality, we make the assumption that every person has the same advantages and the same abilities. This is not the case, and such assumptions ignore the structural and systemic barriers that so many people face in our society. When we work from an equality lens, it can be easy to ignore historical and ongoing social and economic disadvantages. We can arrive at one-size-fits-all approaches which maintain the status quo. Instead, we must recognize that some people face adverse conditions and circumstances that make it more challenging to achieve the same goals with the same effort. At a societal level, we must remove as many structural barriers to equity as we can. We must also recognize and seek to accommodate those who have different needs. We encourage everyone to examine their own choices and actions to identify disadvantage and to do all we can to create a more accepting and equitable society for all. We also call on all Uconners to support programs and policies which recognize historical and ongoing systemic discrimination, and which remove barriers to equitable participation in society. An example of a program that aims to remove barriers to equitable participation in society is affirmative action programs. Affirmative action programs are allowed by the Yukon Human Rights Act. We continue to receive questions from many Yukoners about the legitimacy and necessity of affirmative action programs. In order to see their necessity, we must once more call attention to the difference between equality and equity. If equality in access to housing, employment, and services was the goal, it would be difficult to justify affirmative action programs. Such programs are, by definition, unequal. However, if equity is our goal, their need becomes obvious. Affirmative action programs are needed because the evidence shows that certain segments of our society have long been disadvantaged by the unchangeable facts of who they are. Because of their ancestry or race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, sex, or other characteristics, some members of our society are advantaged over others. This does not mean that all people who are members of socially advantaged groups have easy lives. But it does mean that all other things being equal, some people will face certain advantages or disadvantages in life based solely on things such as the color of their skin. Affirmative action programs recognize this inequity and seek to address this by providing some advantage to those who have otherwise been disadvantaged. Today, the Commission is releasing 3 short videos which will discuss barriers and solutions to 3 of the most common areas of inequity that the Commission hears about: access to housing, employment, and services. This video will discuss barriers that some members of society face in accessing employment in Yukon, and some potential solutions. Employment inequality is a global issue with many regional variations in terms of severity and cause. However, there are some commonalities that exist between our situation in Yukon and the situation globally. We will begin with a brief overview of some of these commonalities at a global, national, and territorial scale. While the human rights complaint process in Yukon may not be able to address some of these broader systemic issues, it is nevertheless important to recognize the global context. Discrimination in employment is a global issue which manifests differently in every country, yet follows similar patterns everywhere. Marginalized communities with diverse cultures, religion, race, sexual orientation, disability, or another protected personal characteristic tend to face the worst working conditions and pay. Globally, there are an estimated 24.9 million people trapped in forced labor, which is understood to be work that is performed involuntarily or under the threat of penalty. This includes 16 million people who are exploited in the private sector, such as domestic work, construction, or agriculture, 4.8 million people in forced sexual exploitation, and 4 million people in forced labor imposed by state authorities. These are various forms of labor exploitation and modern slavery. Another global pattern is that women everywhere continue to face discrimination in employment, despite increasing global awareness, positive progress, and the relentless work of women's grassroots organizations across the world. Although more and more women are working, the pay gap between women and men is still significant in most countries. Additionally, rising levels of global migration have significantly altered patterns of racial discrimination against migrant workers, second and third generation migrants, and citizens of foreign origin. It is the stereotypes and the perception of these workers as foreigners, even when they are not, that may lead to discrimination against them. Discrimination and exploitation in the workplace are present globally, including in Canada. Although Canada and Canadian provinces and territories have human rights legislation, workplace safety legislation, and various legal and policy protections, human rights violations still occur. Research shows that racialized Canadians earn on an average of 81 cents to the dollar compared to other Canadians. Full-time working Canadian women earn 76.8 cents for every dollar men make. This pay gap is even larger for women with intersecting oppressions. Canadians with disabilities also face significant barriers in employment. Among individuals aged 25 to 64 years, only 76% of those with mild disabilities were employed, whereas only 31% of those with very severe disabilities were employed. As the level of severity of a person's disability increases, the likelihood of being employed in Canada decreases. Yukon is not immune to workplace discrimination. Between the year of 2000 and 2016, the gender wage gap in Canada decreased by 24%. Despite this progress, Yukon still had a gender wage gap of 7.95% in 2016. Societal gender norms may contribute to the continued existence of a gender wage gap in Yukon. For example, Women may work fewer hours because they normally take on more domestic responsibilities, particularly childcare, which may affect access to potential workplace opportunities or promotions. Data from 2010 shows that Indigenous men in Yukon with a high school diploma earned 38.7% less than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Indigenous women in Yukon with a high school diploma earned 22.5% less than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Data on wage gaps, employment opportunities, workplace harassment, and other forms of employment discrimination can be difficult to come by, and even more so when it comes to disaggregated data and data that goes beyond the gender binary. More must be done to collect such data in order to understand the issues and take action. Wage gaps, glass ceilings, and limited work opportunities based on characteristics such as race, gender, and disability impact people's employment around the world. These factors disproportionately impact marginalized people and exacerbate inequalities in our society. However, the Yukon Human Rights Act is limited in scope and cannot address all instances of discrimination. It cannot directly change the underlying biases and stereotypes which allow these forms of discrimination to persist. These require education, buy-in from leadership, community knowledge, and policy and process changes. If you have questions about where to go with an issue of discrimination, check out our webpage or give us a call. We will now discuss employment protections under the Yukon Human Rights Act and the kinds of complaints that the Commission has been receiving with respect to discrimination in employment. The Yukon Human Rights Act prohibits discrimination in all aspects of employment. This means that it is against the law for people to be denied employment or experience unfavorable treatment in their employment because of their race, gender, disability, or any other characteristic protected by the Act. The Yukon Human Rights Commission regularly receives complaints and reports of discrimination in Yukon workplaces. Last year alone, the Commission received 151 inquiries about employment issues and complaints about discrimination in employment. And complaints about discrimination in employment make up over half of the complaints accepted for investigation by the Commission. The most common forms of employment discrimination reported to the Commission are discrimination on the basis of disability and sex, including pregnancy. Complaints about discrimination on the basis of disability are overwhelmingly about employers failing to reasonably accommodate a person's disability. Workplace accommodations happen every day in most workplaces. They may be as simple as providing a piece of equipment such as a stool for a cashier with a disability to use who cannot stand the entire shift. Or they may be much more complex. In any case, accommodations are determined on a case-by-case basis and are based on the unique circumstances of a person's disability and their work. In Yukon, employers must accommodate an employee's disability unless it would be an undue hardship for them to do so because of factors such as safety or financial cost. If an employer fails to reasonably accommodate an employee's disability, they may be found to have violated the Yukon Human Rights Act if an employee files a human rights complaint. Complaints about discrimination on the basis of sex in Yukon are most often to do with either sexual harassment or an employer discriminating against an employee for becoming pregnant. This most commonly takes the form of a demotion upon the return from a maternity leave. Yukon has many wonderful employers, and many people may never experience discrimination in their workplace. Nevertheless, it is clear that workplace discrimination continues to occur. We encourage all Yuconners to be aware of these issues and remain vigilant in their own workplaces and practices. If you experience discrimination in your workplace, you likely have several options to report it. Depending on the circumstances, you may be able to go to your manager or supervisor, your union, victim services, the RCMP, the Human Rights Commission, a lawyer, the Workers' Compensation Health and Safety Board, or elsewhere. It is often the people most vulnerable to discrimination who do not feel that they can speak up without risking their job or safety. If you witness something discriminatory, be an ally. Ask the person what you can do to help, even if it's just to let them know they are not alone. If you are a manager or employer and you become aware of something discriminatory in your workplace, you have a legal obligation to take action. Everyone has a role to play in ending workplace discrimination in Yukon, and together we can. In order to understand some of the barriers and solutions to ending inequalities and inequities in Yukon workplaces, we have brought together some voices in our community. Let's hear what they have to say.
Masiri Gastant Aucoin Hello everybody, my name is Duane Gastant Aucoin. I'm with Teslin Tlingit Council. Thank you all for being here this important day. I also want to thank the Algonquin people. I'm a guest of on their beautiful territory here in the Ottawa Valley, looking after my 86-year-old father. When we talk about equity, when we look at it through the eyes of Indigenous, that reconciliation is the big word right now, reconciliation. But there needs to be action that goes along with that reconciliation. I think when Teslin Tlingit Council, when we signed our self-government agreement in 1993, that was a big step in that direction of reconciliation. And it has helped. It has helped a lot. But when we look at, there was a recent survey done within Canada that showed the income levels of Canadians, that the income level of Canadians was at one level and Indigenous peoples were way below. But one sign of encouragement was in the Yukon, the first Yukon First Nations was higher than the national average for Indigenous peoples across the country. So I think that's a sign to show that self-government is helping. But it still showed that Yukon First Nations are still below everyone else in the Yukon. So that shows that there's still a long ways to go when it comes to equity. When we look at employment, that it was such a great day when the Governor General was announced, Mary Simon, Canada's first Indigenous Governor General, and how happy everyone was. And just unfortunate that the focus for many was on that she wasn't bilingual in English and French, even though she was bilingual in English and her language, Inuktitut. And just how many complaints the language commissioner got because of that, because she wasn't bilingual in French. That points out to inequity within the federal system as well, that this Canada Official Languages Act discriminates against Canada's First People. Before there was an English and a French. In this country, there was Indigenous languages. That's one thing the Canada's Official Languages Act does not recognize. I've heard from many employees within the federal system that this requirement to be bilingual in English and French is used against them to keep them in the lower positions and keep them from moving up higher within the system. That's why you don't have very many Indigenous peoples in senior positions within the federal government. One of the things that my First Nation is pushing is to get an exemption under Canada's Official Languages Act for Indigenous peoples, so that we don't have to be bilingual in English and French. That recognizes that we, as the original peoples of this land, that our languages are not English and French, that our languages existed again long before there was Canada, long before English and French was spoken on these lands. So we're hoping that that with this exemption, that it will take down one more systemic barrier that's used to hold our people back, so that our people start sitting in those seats of decision making seats to have an effect on the federal government, and especially within Indigenous affairs, so that it improves things for us. And so I think that's one thing when we talk about equity, that we need to break down those systemic barriers that hold us back. And this putting some window dressing on things and making things look pretty, that might look good for a photo op, but that's not really going to change the lives of the people that need the change. So that's one thing that I encourage everyone to work towards, is changing things from the inside out, and bringing real change that'll benefit and impact us people, Indigenous people, those who suffer under systemic racism and systemic inequality, that it'll benefit us for the good of everybody. So Atlan Gunchish, thank you very much. Yugwai Juan, take care and do your best.
Hi, my name is Jason Cook and my pronouns are he, him. I'm coming to you today from the traditional grounds of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Tan-Gwachon Council. I'm very grateful for that. I'm an educator here in the Yukon. I currently work closely with our Rainbow youth up at Porter Creek Secondary School. Over the past few years, I've collaborated with our amazing Porter Creek administration team and staff to open up the PCSS Rainbow Room, which is our school's safe space. It's a space where students can go and just be themselves, free from any sort of harassment or bullying. I also serve as the leader of the Porter Creek Gender and Sexuality Alliance, and I worked with the students that successfully petitioned the banning of conversion therapy here in the Yukon back in 2020. I'm honored to be speaking to you today on Human Rights Day 2021. This is the day back in 1948 when the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR. And the UDHR proclaimed the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. As a gay man living in the Yukon, I feel grateful to have protections that many in the queer communities around the world don't share. But even though Yukon's Two-Spirit and queer communities are protected by human rights legislation, it doesn't mean that some in our community still don't face instances of harassment and discrimination in their daily lives. Data regarding TUS LGBTQ Canadians is limited in Canada, but we do know that members of the trans community face higher rates of violence. Mental health challenges persist with higher rates of depression and suicide, or simply, things just like finding a safe doctor, obtaining a decent job, or even securing an affordable home can be a real challenge for members of the TUS LGBTQ community. When it comes to employment, Yukon human rights legislation protects against discrimination in connection with any aspect of employment or application for employment. But a quick Google search will turn up headlines like, researchers confirm substantial income disparities amongst TUS LGBTQ Canadians. Many would agree that the experience of TUS LGBTQ people in the workplace says more can be done to support those employees and make places of work more inclusive. But much of the research to date has been focused on large urban areas, so we don't know as much about smaller places or smaller cities. Some studies have found that 50% of TUS LGBTQ employees surveyed said they hide their sexual orientation from managers and coworkers. And many people had left their jobs because they didn't find their workplace supportive. Workers want employers and unions to actively show that they are supportive of the 2S LGBTQ community. If they don't say anything, people take it as a sign that the employer is not supportive. And, people experience discrimination or harassment from clients if they're in service jobs, and if employers allow these instances to happen, employees feel unprotected and unsupported. Despite recent efforts by Stats Canada to collect information on transgender, two-spirit, and non-binary people in 2021 in the census, that data has not yet been made available, and it prevents researchers from knowing sort of the full story of what's going on in the workplace. Without relevant data, employers have a tough time also setting targets, even if an organization has a strong commitment to inclusion. Learning from this research is going to help a lot of employers better understand how to make a positive impact on the challenges being faced by 2S LGBTQ employees, instead of relying on assumptions and stereotypes, which really only just end up exacerbating the situation for two-spirit and queer workers and job seekers. Organizations need to begin to normalize the diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity at work and depart from the status quo of heteronormative culture. Educational initiatives like the use of proper pronouns is an important first step businesses and other organizations can take to make employees feel more welcome in their places of employment. And that's really just a win for everyone involved.
Greetings, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Birju Detani, and I'm the director at the Yukon Human Rights Commission. We're grateful to have heard from Duane Gastant Aucoin of the Teslin Tlingit Council. He talks about the concepts of equity and reconciliation and the fact that there needs to be accompanying action. Indigenous incomes are lower than non-Indigenous incomes in similar spheres. And while the Yukon is better than most because of self-governing agreements, there is still a gap. With the appointment of Mary Simon as Governor General of Canada was a wonderful achievement and represented a wonderful day. It is unfortunate that for many the focus was on her non-fluency in French, even though she is fluent in English and her mother tongue is Inuktitut. This is yet another example of inequity. Under the Official Languages Act, there is no weight given to Indigenous languages, and this prevents upward mobility in federal government for Indigenous public servants. The Teslin Tlingit Council is pushing for an exemption to the Official Languages Act for Indigenous people and their languages, and that this would remove a systemic barrier and allow more Indigenous people to have a voice at senior decision-making tables. There is a need to break down systemic barriers. We must take concrete action rather than being satisfied with superficial measures. Everyone is encouraged to work to change systems from the inside out for the good of all. We're grateful to have heard from Jason Cook, who's a member of the queer community and is an educator. Jason reminds us that while data is limited in Canada relative to the queer community, we do know that there are higher rates of depression and suicide, and this is exacerbated by the difficulties involved with finding a safe doctor, a good job, and an affordable home. While human rights protections do exist relative to employment, income disparities continue to exist. More can be done to make workplaces inclusive, but most research is focused on large urban areas and less is known about rural workplaces. Many continue to hide their sexual orientation from managers and coworkers, and many leave unsupportive jobs. Employees and workers want active signs of support, as silence is taken as a lack of support. Jason has reminded us that harassment, unfortunately, continues to happen. The data gap is also a major issue. It is hard to set targets, and it is hard to take meaningful action without it. A lack of data is often a breeding ground for stereotypes. We are also reminded of the need to depart from the status quo of heteronormative culture and the importance of education in this area. Theme which runs through many of our speakers' presentations is the idea of data and information. Equity and diversity cannot be a box-ticking exercise. We know that discrimination is about systems and not simply a pattern of individual behaviors. We have to look at how processes and systems that we rely on perpetuate inequality. In other words, how do we make decisions on a daily basis in organizations that we belong to? How are those decision-making processes advantaging certain people, and how many others are deprived or disenfranchised as a result of these systems? When we look to accumulate more and better data, we fundamentally understand that discrimination is inherently about systems, and therefore we have to look at how these systems, which have existed for far too long, have to be reevaluated, renegotiated, and where necessary, dismantled in the interest of serving the goals of having a society which is truly equal. And in order to do so, we have to reimagine our ideas around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Having heard from our communities, it is essential that we all commit to those rights enshrined 73 years ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let us take this opportunity to reflect, but more importantly, to commit ourselves anew to a more just and equitable society where everyone is truly equal in dignity and rights. Thank you. Merci.